Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rafe with Greenpointe.
I'm Craig.
Today we're doing a little question and answer about grits of sandpaper and why you don't skip more than one at a time. So for starters, Craig, explain to me a little bit about what grits are appropriate for what situation.
Well, that's a great question, Rafe. So the reason why they make so many different grits is because the situation of what you're trying to sand off. And so if you've got an old floor that has a lot of paint, wax, or glue, something like that, then you need a really, really coarse grit. On the average floor, if you're just taking off old finish, or if you're just taking and sanding down the height difference from board to board on a brand new install, 40 grit is plenty good to start out with. But sometimes if you got an old floor that has wax or paper or wax paint or glue on it, and you pull up the carpet and you try to resand it and it all gums up, and usually you can tell because it's kind of a brownish, light brown stuff that cakes up on the sandpaper. That's usually wax. A lot of floors back in the day, the only way to maintain a wood floor was with paste wax, and so even though it doesn't look like there's anything on the floor, a lot of times there'll be some wax residue down in the pores, and that doesn't get heated up until you try to sand it off, and then it sticks to the sandpaper. So you run across something like that, that's why they make the super coarse grit, like a 24. They even do make a 16 grit as well, and that is to make to where it cuts through all that gunk and without heating up as much. And so that way then you can get down to bare wood. Then you get back to the 40 grit. So if you start out with a 16 grit, you're not skipping a grit, you're actually adding a grit. And the whole reason why there's progression of grits is because you have to go through and get aggressive, but you're going to put some really coarse scratches in the floor, in the wood.
I think.
And
yeah. So and you've done some diagrams here.
Did a little diagram here, and a lot of sandpaper manufacturers and even the National Wood Flooring Association has done diagrams just like this to explain the whole process. So the straight line here is a brand new floor, or a floor that hasn't been sanded yet. So when you get your sander out and you throw on, say, 40 grit sandpaper, and you go through and sand the floor, basically what happens is you create this peak and valley scratch in the floor. And when you do that, to get rid of those peaks and valleys, basically to get rid of the scratches, that's why you have to go through a progression of grits. So then once you're done with your coarse grit, to do this, to get it down to clean bare wood or flat, then you go to a medium grit, usually like a 60 grit. And this is a 60 here. You can see it's not quite as coarse as the 40 grit. And what happens is basically you knock the peaks off of all these scratches, and you wind up with something along these lines. So you still have little scratches in there, but they're not near as radical as they were at the beginning. And then once you're done with that, then you would go to your final grit, which usually is like 100 grit, which is this here, which you can see is much finer than the 60. And so at that point, you barely have any scratch left. You've sanded that peak all the way down to the valley. So to go through those grits, that's what happens.
So explain to us, Craig, then what happens if, for example, you were to start with a 40 or even as low as a 24 and then jump straight to a, if you start with a 24 and jump straight to a 60, what are you going to be left with?
So just to make an illustration easy here, I did a little thing like this. So what would happen is you would go from this peak and valley here, and if I went through and just sanded with 100 grit after that, what happens is all you're doing is just barely knocking the peaks off. So you still got these big radical valleys there. So the 100 grit, it just isn't, or a fine grit, just isn't aggressive enough to get rid of those large valleys that you create with a coarser grit.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Craig. Hopefully that's good education for anybody out there that had questions regarding grit progression. Is there any other information that you were wanting to fill us in on, Craig?
Nope. The thing is, if you start out with finer grits, yes, you don't leave the big peaks and valleys, but you wind up having to go over that floor multiple times to get to the same point of doing one of each grit. So it actually saves time and money because less sandpaper by going through a progression of grit than to try to skip grits. One very important thing, and this is going to be the rule on any sandpaper, whatever grit or whatever manufacturer it is or whatever type of mineral it is, never skip more than one grit. So if you're starting with a 40, then you would go to 60. If you can't go from 40 to 80 or 40 to 100, that kind of a thing. So,
and like Craig said earlier, that's not just us saying that. That comes from the National Wood Flooring Association, as well as any sandpaper manufacturer that you speak with. They're going to recommend or even straight up tell you that you don't skip more than one grit. So thanks again for watching, guys. Hopefully this was informational, and hopefully this helps with any questions that you might have had. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and follow us, watch the rest of our content, and have a great rest of your day and a great week. And thanks again from the team at Greenpointe.
happy sanding.